So it's a real pleasure to be welcoming you to our second State of Democracy lecture for the year. I'm Grant Reher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, the institute which coordinates this lecture series. And on behalf of Syracuse University, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands we now sit. Today, I think we can think of this as an intellectual tailgating party. And we talked about getting a kettle barbecue out in the foyer, but the fire marshal didn't really like that idea very much. But we are having a reception after the talk, and if you're over 21, there will be beer and wine there. So it's not bad. It's coming pretty close. As I said at our first lecture in this series, we strive with some of our lectures to engage perennial topics, and then with other lectures to engage pressing current issues. And I think as we did in our first lecture, with this lecture by Alan Greenblatt on the relations between the federal and state government and with our current president, we've been able to do both at the same time with his talk. And before I say more about Alan and our format for today, let me just issue a few heartfelt thanks. First, I want to thank the Dean's Office for supporting the series. We're always very pleased to have that support. For technical support, the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. I want to thank as well Kelly Coleman and Sanju Raybeck, who work in the Campbell Institute and help put together these events. And I also want to give special thanks to the wonderful graduate MPA students and undergraduate students that we have helping us with this event today. For our format, we'll hear from Alan, and he'll talk for 50 minutes or so, and then we'll move directly to questions and comments. And one of the reasons for that, rather than to have a faculty respondent or two, is that I think there's going to be a lot of questions about the midterm elections, and Alan has a lot to say about that. We've had a fascinating series of conversations just this afternoon, both he and I individually, and then with small groups of students, about some of the different patterns at the state and local level that are just not getting the same level of attention that the congressional elections did, but they're really fascinating and really important. So let me make a few reminders here first before I say more about Alan and the topic. First, please silence your smartphones if you haven't done that already. Second, when we get to the audience Q&A portion, please wait for the microphone to be passed to you. I will call on, I think I'll try to call on two folks at a time, but wait for the microphone to be passed to you before you speak, and that's so that everybody can hear you, but also so that you're part of our archive of the event and the live stream. And then, as I said before, following the talk, we'll have a reception out in the foyer where there will be refreshments and we can continue the conversation that we begin here. So let me just end with a few words about Alan and his topic. Struggles between the state and the federal government, occasioned by actions taken by presidential administrations, are certainly not new to the American political landscape. Indeed, I think they're woven into the very fabric of our politics from the very outset. But in the course of these ongoing struggles, we also hit moments of particular historical importance, and we may be in the midst of one of them now. We just had our midterms, and again, I was talking to Alan about these. I can never remember in my lifetime a set of state elections that were so occupied with national issues and so occupied with a president. So I'm very curious to hear what Alan, a longtime student and observer of state politics and policy, is making of this moment. And I'm also very glad and delighted that he is simply here. He has had a torturous journey to get here from St. Louis involving 2 days and lost luggage, which is why he is dressed more informally than our State of Democracy speakers normally are. That was not his intention, but we're just glad that he's here. But let me say a little bit about his background before I turn the floor over to him. He's especially well situated and qualified to reflect on these issues of federal-state relations and on state politics more generally, particularly, again, after the midterms. For over 2 decades, Alan has been covering politics and government. He's currently a staff writer for Governing Magazine, the leading publication on state politics and policy. He has a wide beat for the magazine, including writing the Observer column, which opens the magazine every month. He's also done longer form pieces for outlets such as Congressional Quarterly Researcher. Alan's past posts include NPR and Congressional Quarterly, where he won a National Press Club Award for political journalism. He's also written for newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. So again, we're very glad to have him here to talk about these important topics. And Alan, welcome to the Maxwell School, and the floor is yours.
This is the first time I've given a subtitled talk, so it should be easier to follow. And yeah, it did take me about 20 hours to get here. My luggage is still trying, so I apologize for the casual Friday look. So I'm really impressed by how many people came out here to talk about federalism on a Friday afternoon when it's snowing and there's a football game, so I appreciate that. And I'm trying to remember all my best federalism jokes, but anyway, I'm going to talk about a lot of things. It is an interesting moment in federalism. I'll talk a little bit about what federalism is, why it's become so contentious of late, and I will talk some about the elections and some of the divisions and patterns we see that feed both into the political results and the tensions in federalism. Anybody know which state capital this is? Quick quiz. They all look the same, so it's a trick question. That's Wisconsin. So it's especially a pleasure to be here at Syracuse and at Maxwell. At governing, we used to do a project called the Government Performance Project, or grading the states, and Maxwell did the heavy-hitting data crunching, deep, in-depth stuff. It was a look at how each state did in terms of nuts and bolts of management and finance and that kind of thing, and we ran that in the magazine. And so our magazine really is kind of a product of federalism. It started its first issue in 1987. Ronald Reagan was president, and he talked about the new federalism, which was going to be a transfer of power to the states. And it's a little remembered. I was just thinking about this, actually. Reagan proposed that the federal government take over the whole of the bill for Medicaid, which is roughly split, with the federal government paying about 57% on average of the cost and states doing the other 43%. And in exchange, he wanted the states to take over welfare and food stamps and some other programs. And the governors actually objected to this, much to the regret of their successors, because the growth of Medicaid spending has been exponential ever since. So anyway, our founding publisher and editor, Peter Harkness, was an editor at CQ. And he was hearing all this rhetoric about how power was going to shift to the states, and he said, maybe we should cover the states. And the original name of the magazine was going to be 50, which would not have lasted this long, I'm sure. Anyway, in the very first cover is Fend for Yourself Federalism, which is a made-up term. But the idea was Reagan was cutting some of the direct aid to cities and states, and so they were going to have to fend for yourself. And federalism is always a term. It's kind of almost a meaningless term. It's always defined with an adjective. Layer cakes and marble cakes is a classic one. So the layer cake idea is that each layer of government is separate with distinct roles, federal, state, and local. Marble cake is probably more accurate, that they're all mixed up, that funding for education and transportation and health, money goes up and down the ladder. There are mandates from the federal government and money coming in from states and so on and so forth. But there are all kinds of terms. I made this purposely sort of an ugly slide because it's kind of an ugly idea that, with dual federalism, cooperative federalism, all these different ideas. It basically talks about how transient the idea is. The relationship between Washington and the states and the states and the cities, which I'll talk a little bit, is always in flux. Sometimes it's more hostile with more mandates from Washington. Sometimes it's more cooperative. So here's my mandatory founding father slide. And, we kind of forget, if you remember your American history, the colonies were pretty separate, and we had the Articles of Confederation. We didn't really have a central government. We had a Congress, but no presidency. That didn't work out too well. But that generation, they thought of, when we're in school, we're talking about the separation of powers. It's always the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But they sort of thought of states as another kind of branch of government that would be a check on the others. And so they passed the 10th Amendment, which reserves power to the states that are not expressly enumerated for the federal government in the Constitution. And they also, in those times when they set up the Senate, state legislatures picked the senators. It was only about 100 years ago that we had direct election of senators. So that was going to be the states having a direct voice in Washington. So here's an ugly slide. Anyway, I just want to make the point. A lot of it's what I'm going to talk about has to do with money. This is a chart showing who pays what share of Medicaid costs. As I said, it's kind of split between the feds and the states. New York, I think, is the only state where local governments have to chip in directly. So, it's grown over time. The Affordable Care Act had an expansion of Medicaid where the federal government, for the first 3 years, was going to pay 100% of the cost. It was going to change the eligibility levels. There was never a standard measure for how poor you had to be. Each state said it differently for pregnant women or women with 2 kids. That was done state by state. And part of the Affordable Care Act was going to have Medicaid have a uniform baseline for that. And the feds were going to pay 100% of the costs for the new enrollees and then 90% from here on out. Anyway, I'll talk about that a little more. So this slide is just another ugly slide just to show it's very confusing how money flows in our transportation system. Money just goes up and down. You pay your gas tax at the pump. The city collects it. It sends it to the state. The state sends some back in a formula to the local government and sends most of it, sends a federal tax up to Washington, and Washington sends money back to the states for the interstates. And that's kind of a simple example of how crazy it is. Here's how money flows from the federal government to the states for transportation. You obviously can't read that, but there are many stages. It's all more complicated than we think about. So is federalism an important topic in Washington? Well, this is a quote I'm going to put up from a congressman from Utah who's now head of the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs. This is the idea of federalism. If a state wants to be stupid, why should the federal government tell them otherwise? In practice, nobody in Washington cares about federalism as an end in itself. I mean, there's some that pay lip service. There are a lot of former governors and state senators and whatnot who are in Washington, and they say it's important that the states not be told what to do by Washington. But in practice, they'd rather tell them what to do because we have to have a national policy on immigration or on gun control or on gun rights or whatever it might be. So the people in power in Washington always oppose states' rights. Doing so preserves their own. So states' rights became this term, not exactly a synonym for federalism, but it became somewhat synonymous with federalism. It was part of the lost cause mythology in the South. The South did not fight to preserve slavery. It fought for states' rights to have the option to preserve slavery. This was part of the excuse making after the fact. And so states' rights became almost kind of an ugly term because it became very associated with race. And again, in the civil rights era, the same thing. Are you for states' rights? So this is George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door, as was always described. He was the governor of Alabama. There he's trying to block 2 black students from entering the university. And the fellow sort of hunched over is Nicholas Katzenbach, who was a Justice Department official. He became Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson. This is 1963. Of course, the South was insisting that it didn't have to it should be able to set its own racial terms. So that kind of discredited the idea of federalism. It became associated with that very heavily. So we'll move right ahead to when Obama was president. Here he's shaking hands with Bill Peduto, who's the mayor of Pittsburgh. If you've seen him in the news in the past week or so, after the shooting in the synagogue, he's got a kind of Santa Claus beard there. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. What's unusual about Obama with federalism is that he turned directly to the states. Typically, there are these layers. Washington tells the states what to do. States tell cities and counties what to do. Cities and counties say, why can't I tell anyone what to do? But Obama decided to bypass states on a lot of issues and work directly with mayors because he could, once Republicans took control of the House and then the Senate, he couldn't get anything he wanted. So he worked with mayors like Peduto, Marty Walsh in Boston, Michael Coleman in Columbus, a lot of them on programs they wanted: minimum wage increases, early childhood education, paid sick leave, and all that kind of thing. In the meantime, we're having opposition to Obama from Republican states. So this is Greg Abbott, who just won re-election this week as governor of Texas. in those, before he was governor, he was the Attorney General of Texas. And when he ran for governor the first time, he sued Obama or the administration about 36 times, often about environmental regulations, but also about the Affordable Care Act and many other things. And his campaign slogan, practically, he would continually say at every appearance when he ran for governor the first time, "My job is I go to the office, I sue the federal government, and I go home." That's how he saw his role. And this is an older picture. Attorney General was kind of a do-nothing job almost for a good while. But 20 years ago, they started to feel their power. So this is a group of attorneys general who were the lead actors in a case against the tobacco industry. And so the guy in front is named Mike Moore, not the documentary maker, obviously. Does anybody recognize Richard Blumenthal on the left there? And in the shadows, you really can't make out Dennis Vaco, who was your attorney general back then. Anyway, Mike Moore was the attorney general of Mississippi, and his brother-in-law had the idea of suing the tobacco industry. And the theory was states pay a good amount of money for health care through Medicaid, and because people's health was ruined by cigarette smoking, they could sue the tobacco industry for damages. And so they started winning some settlements, and then they kicked it up to Congress to pass a law that would create financial penalties and also change some of the regulations on advertising and the warning labels and so forth. And that bill died in Congress. And the Attorney General said, okay, well, we'll do it ourselves. And they did a global settlement. 4 states had already done separate settlements, but then this group, 46 states joined together, and they did this huge settlement on the tobacco, with the tobacco industry, $246 billion over 25 years, and a lot of regulations. And the attorneys general realized they could themselves become national regulators. So they took on banks, and Elliot Spitzer became famous for this, but it happened all over. So here's my key slide, I guess. So this is, we'll show you multi-state lawsuits against the federal government over time. So these first few years I'm showing you are the Clinton years. Clinton years. So when we say multi-state lawsuits, that doesn't mean every state. What typically happens is some states, especially with these big consumer cases, some states would sue a big industry, they'd get a big settlement, every other attorney general would say, I'll take some of that too, thank you. Anyway, these lawsuits against the United States, it's not every state, this is 2 or more states. And if you went back in time to Reagan or earlier, this was typical, 1 or 2 times a year, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, but usually not that many. And then under Bush, a few more. So Bush, this is the George W. Bush, he had what we would call a kind of coercive federalism, where he wanted the states to do what he wanted. He'd been the governor of Texas, and he had a lot of governors in his cabinet, but nonetheless, he had his policies, and he wanted states to tack them out. Most famously, the No Child Left Behind law, which mandated standardized tests on reading and math and so forth every year, grades 3 through 8. Anyway, so there's some pushback as reflected there. And then under Obama, it climbs up considerably. And this, Greg Abbott was famous for this. Scott Pruitt was the Attorney General of Oklahoma before he became the head of EPA and before he became the ex-head of EPA. Anyway, they sued Obama all the time. They had the case against the Affordable Care Act, which was about Medicaid funding. The law said you had to agree to these new baseline eligibility requirements I was describing earlier, or lose your traditional Medicaid funding. And they said that was coercive, and the Supreme Court agreed, which is why we still have states that have not adopted the Medicaid expansion. So this was, an all-time record the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, 13 per year. So then Trump became president, and it's exploded. So 37 last year, 24 so far this year. And the number is only down this year because so many of the cases from last year are still going on. And this doesn't reflect individual attorneys general who sue like crazy. The guy in California, Xavier Becerra, in Massachusetts, Maura Healey, Bob Ferguson in Washington, and when Eric Schneiderman, before he became your ex-attorney general, they've all sued like 40 times apiece, sued the federal government. So I have a quote I wrote down from Schneiderman. last year, the states sued to block the ban on Muslims or ban on people from certain Muslim majority countries. We just started talking to each other Friday afternoon. By Sunday, we had 17 states signed on to say this is unconstitutional. So they've created these collaborative networks like, let's go, let's sue this guy, and we'll all go in together. And of course, under Obama, it was the Republican attorneys general suing a Democratic president, now the opposite. And so, we have all these multi-state lawsuits. And for the attorney general races this year, this became a frame. I will do the most to oppose Trump. I will lead the resistance. And they were playing this role, like they were suing him over DACA, over environmental rules, over all kinds of stuff. So, and it's even in pop culture. The lead subhead there by Aretha's Eyes, can California stop Trump? This is now the phrase, like we have the idea of states being agents of resistance. So in your new attorney general, this is how the New York Times announced her victory. Promises to take on Trump. Like this is central to the job description. Democrats, by the way, picked up 4 AG, or I hate the plural, attorneys general. Anyway, Colorado, Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin. So it went from 27-23 Republican to 27-23 Democrat, exact flip. And in older times, it was always a predominantly Democratic job. They were the only ones interested in it. And it was when the attorneys general started suing all these corporations that the corporation said, we better get some guys in there to block this. So anyway, of course, with this election, it was not just AGs saying they would stand up to Trump. This is the Democrat in New Hampshire who lost the governor's race. We need a governor who will stand up to Trump. Gavin Newsom, who won out in California, Democrat, said the election will anoint the next head of the resistance. I mean, he was very much seeing that frame. So, of course, it's primarily, again, Democratic governors. But here's Larry Hogan on the left, the governor of Maryland, and Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. They're both Republicans, both moderate to liberal Republicans. They both won. And this was kind of a funny moment. This is kind of the theater of federalism almost. I don't mean to make fun of a serious issue, but when the kids in cages was the top story, some of the states, Maryland and Massachusetts with Republican governors, but lots with Democratic governors like Oregon and so forth, said they were not going to send their National Guard troops to the border. The National Guard is sort of a funny federalism entity too, where it can be federalized, but it's the governor is the commander-in-chief. But it takes a war or disaster or emergency for the federal government to take over. Of course, I should have had a slide of Eisenhower nationalizing the National Guard in Little Rock in 1957, another famous integration moment. Anyway, a lot of these were purely symbolic. I can't remember exactly, but Baker and Hogan, their states both had like one helicopter and 5 troops at the border. The governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper's Democrat, he had a press conference saying, he was putting out an executive order saying, we ban the use of any state funds for this action. And the reporter said, are any state funds being used for this action? No, not that we know of. But this is an NPR page, but you could get in the national news because you're opposing Trump. So to jump back in time just for a minute, just for context, I want to say it's not new. I mean, it's very heated at the moment, but it's not a brand new thing. So this was a headline from the 2009 stimulus. So those of you who remember, Obama came in, we were in deep recession, and the Democrats, with a little bit of Republican support at the time, passed this $800 billion stimulus package, much of which flowed through the states. So again, the money is always very complicated. So like highway funding, the interstates are federal highways, but they're actually built and maintained by states. So the states put in a request for money to the federal government. They say, we have this project that we think will be good. It'll get easier access to the airport, whatever. The federal government approves it, let's say, and then they send a check back for 90% of the cost. So anyway, the money is always flowing up and down, and 2/3 of the money in the non-defense discretionary budget, in the federal budget, goes through states. So that means not entitlements, not Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and not defense, obviously, but everything else, education, environment, everything else basically goes to the states. The federal government writes checks, and states then write checks to the local governments or nonprofits or whatever. So it's all very convoluted, but you got to follow the money, as the cliche says. So here I'll tell this famous joke. This guy is coming in from National Airport into Washington, D.C., and he drives up Independence Avenue, and he sees the Forest Service and the Agriculture Department and the Energy Department and the Transportation Department. He says to the cab driver, "How many people work in all these buildings?" And the guy says, "About half." So that's the joke. So the federal government does a lot of things, but mainly it writes checks to states. And the stimulus in particular, it's one of the best kept secrets of the Obama era that a third of the money was tax cuts. For some reason, he never played that up. But a lot of the money was, the cliche at the time was shovel-ready projects, so infrastructure. There was also money for unemployment, which is another program with a lot of connections between the federal government and the states in terms of who pays the bills. Anyway, so a lot of the Republican governors at the time said, we don't want the money. They didn't want the high-speed rail money. They didn't want the unemployment money. And it was the same logic that later came with the Medicaid money. Even though the feds are giving us money and say they'll give us more, we know they may not give us as much as they promise. And anyway, we don't even want to pay the 10% because our budget's already out of balance. So Mark Sanford then was the governor of South Carolina before he became the ex-governor of South Carolina, before he became congressman, before he's now an ex-congressman. Anyway, Sarah Palin was big on this, so forth. A lot of them said, we're not going to take your stinking money. So anyway, and as I suggested earlier, there was a lot of legal action against Obama. So one party's in power, and the party that controls at least some of the states takes on the party in power in Washington. So here I get into the political moment of the talk. So this is the Trump map. So it was an amazing accomplishment, as he always reminds us. So anyway, we've had this concept of red and blue states going back since the 2000 election. And states since then have been pretty much locked in. They're either red or blue. And it wasn't as true at the state level. There were more red states electing Democratic governors and vice versa, but it's become pretty true. And for a long time, I didn't accept it because at the state level it was not as polarized as in the presidential voting. But did anybody know the book, The Big Sort? Anybody happen to hear that? Any students? So this book came out like 10 years ago. And the idea was people were sorting themselves, moving into like-minded communities that shared their values. So sort of the cliche would be the Prius, Whole Foods, Starbucks people versus the Cracker Barrel, shotgun in the back of the pickup truck people. And when he wrote the book, he said, it's not that people look at precinct level voter data, but somehow through these cultural cues, they find their own people, and then the political voting tends to be similar, more and more by demographic type of all sorts. So anyway, at the time, he made this point about landslide counties, which were counties that voted with a 20% or greater margin in the presidential race. So in 1976, the Ford-Carter race was very close, almost tied nationally. 25% of the country lived in so-called landslide counties. And then for Trump, it's now 60% of the country lives in landslide counties, so mostly red, and then some blue. So we're living in separate worlds. And the key thing about this last Tuesday's election was that the rich suburbs, the affluent, educated suburbs, went for Democrats. That's where they made their gains at the House and also at the state level. It's not a great chart, but the top line, you can see in 2010, when Republicans took the House, they picked up a bunch of seats in these educated suburbs. And this, as the Wall Street Journal, however, they decided to define it. Anyway, and they lost almost 30 seats their last time. Or another way to put it, Democrats are winning seats with Whole Foods, and Republicans are not holding the seats with Whole Foods. So getting further into our in-depth study of Whole Foods counties, this chart shows you the difference over time. So back in 1992, the Clinton election, there's only about a 20% gap. Republicans always do better in the Cracker Barrel counties, but there's only about a 22% gap. Under Trump, it was a 55% gap. He won about 70% of the vote in the Cracker Barrel counties and lost badly with the organic produce folks. And we see the split now everywhere within states. So here's your state. I cut off the top half, but I promise it's all red from up there. State Senate results, here's a little zooming in. You can see the upstate mostly red. They've got a nice little pull out there on the right on the top of Syracuse. But then almost all the seats are in the city, and then, they did better than expected in the Hudson Valley and made inroads into Long Island, they being the Democrats. And this is the case all over. I'm going to show you some other maps from around the country from Tuesday. So this is Minnesota, and it's pulled out the Twin Cities. This is the governor's race. No, this is the House race, the state House races. So the right-hand corner that's sticking out there, that's like Duluth, the Iron Range, that's historically Democratic. It was mining, it was union. I guess those legislative districts are still voting Democratic, but that's actually one of the, I think, 2 seats the Republicans won for the state House. And then, of course, the Democrats dominating in the Twin Cities area that's pulled out. This is the governor's map for Iowa. It was a close race. So Iowa always interests me because I don't know why. Anyway, so you can see those these two in the middle. It's Des Moines. It's obviously the biggest city, and then Ames, which is Iowa State. It's the big cities and the college towns that are voting Democratic. So like 10 years ago, everything west of there, about half the Democrats in the state Senate came from west there. Now there isn't a single Democrat left. All the vote is on this corridor here, Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is. Here's a little factoid I was really interested in 2016. So the eastern edge is defined by the Mississippi River. Obama won every one of those counties in 2012, and then Trump won every one of those counties in 2016, except the one where Davenport is, which he lost by about 1,000 votes. So we're seeing this all over the country. So I live in Missouri. This is the Senate map. So you can see the blue, of course, Democrat, Claire McCaskill, the incumbent. She won St. Louis, Columbia, where the University of Missouri is, and Kansas City in one of the Kansas City suburbs. And then the other 115 counties went for Josh Hawley, the Republican, our new senator. McCaskill, actually, she sort of set a template when she first ran 12 years ago, I guess it was. She realized most of the Democratic vote was in the 2 big cities, but if she could cut the margins in like St. Charles County, which is a suburb of St. Louis, and keep it close, she could win. So she actually came out 12 years ago and announced victory. She was running against the Republican incumbent. She announced victory even though she was behind in the polls because she knew most of these states don't have many people. She knew he'd run out of state to get the vote. This time she did a reverse strategy. She counted on the St. Louis and Kansas City vote and went all over the state to all these counties that had given Hillary Clinton like 20% of the vote, thinking maybe she could get it to 25 or 30. So she failed. And this happened for Democrats all over. It's really the story of the Georgia race. The Atlanta, of course, and the Atlanta suburbs went for Stacey Abrams, but Brian Kemp, the Republican, went into the similar, very red rural counties, and he actually beat Trump's margin in a lot of those places. So places that voted 90% for Trump voted like 92% for him. And here's another visualization. I guess this is the Virginia Senate race, not as a map, but you can see the size of the county and the vote. So the bigger counties went Democratic, the smaller counties went Republican, and that's true all over. And Wisconsin is a great example. I showed you the Wisconsin Capitol. So here's my obligatory New Yorker cartoon. I don't know, how many of you read Russian? So this is from 2016, and it's translated, it all comes down to Waukesha County. So Waukesha is one of the Milwaukee suburbs. It's very Republican, and if you're a Russian, that's where you want to invest your dollars. And it worked, right? I mean, Trump carried Wisconsin. So anyway, and so Scott Walker, the Republican governor of Wisconsin, was up this time. He lost. And the vote in Wisconsin is Madison and Milwaukee versus everybody else. Again, the big city and the college town against the rest of the state. And that pretty much held this time. But Walker needed a big vote in Waukesha and the other Milwaukee suburban counties because the other counties don't have a lot of people. So there's this amazing quote today from the Republican Speaker of the State Assembly there, so the Democrats won 4 out of the 5 statewide races, barely, but they didn't gain a single seat in the legislature. And the Republicans, in fact, gained a seat in the state Senate. And they have, a very strong gerrymander there. Plus, they have the Democrats conveniently all living in just 2 places. So the Democrats, of course, are complaining we should have won, but it's a terrible gerrymandered map. It's unfair to us. So the Republican Assembly Speaker was quoted in the Milwaukee paper today. He said, if you took Madison and Milwaukee out of the state election formula, we would have had a clear majority. We would have had all 5 constitutional officers, and we would have probably had many more seats in the legislature. Sure, if 500,000 people didn't vote, we would have won. But this is kind of the attitude. They don't count. People in the cities, they don't count. They don't vote for us. And who cares? So this map is one that, which is this map? I should have done my homework better. Anyway, this map is actually one showing the House race, the popular vote for the House within each state. So the reason it's interesting, Democrats carry the vote in all these states. So this is actually the 2012 map. So this is the exact same map. Democrats did well where Obama did well, including places that had switched from Obama to Trump. So the vote on Tuesday showed, like I say, we're going in 2 different directions. The red area is going very red. The blue area is going very blue. Democrats making inroads into the suburbs, and some places reverting to a pre-Trump voting pattern. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the urban-rural split, and I'm going to get back to federalism. I know everyone's dying for that. So half of the country lives in 143 counties, and there are about 3,100 counties. So there are 3,000 counties with not that many people, and you can sort of see it's the same places. Another way of putting it, LA County alone has more population than 43 states. Not a total, but it's bigger than 43 other states. Harris County, which is Houston, is more populous than 25 other states. Democrats are in these tiny, tiny spots. This is just a list of the 25 largest cities. You can see in red, only 4 have Republican mayors. Democrats have really come to dominate the big cities. But here's the legislative map after Tuesday. We have 1 split state, Minnesota. The Democrats took the House, but the Senate was not up, so it stayed Republican. So this is the first time since 1914 that we have only 1 divided legislature in the country. Usually, when I started, states were very competitive internally. Now they are red or blue. Republicans have every state legislature, or they control legislature in every state that Trump won. And Democrats, as you can see, are pretty much in the Obama states. If they're looking at the legislative level, they don't even have all those. They have every legislature. Like I say, the Trump one and every one in the Midwest except for Illinois and now the Minnesota House. So you take this combination of blue cities and red states, and you get preemption, which is another aspect of federalism, where the states tell cities what they can and can't do. So this is, again, not a new thing. This was from a American Political Science Review study 5 years ago, looking at relative clout of rural and urban areas going back more than a century. And they found rural, smaller population to bigger, the smaller population places got bills that they wanted, which were, money for a park or whatever specific to their area. The bigger cities got less. So there's always been this outstate resentment of the big city. People in the rest of Missouri hate St. Louis. People in the rest of Indiana hate Indianapolis. People in Kentucky hate Louisville, et cetera, et cetera. And they're usually not willing to give them much. They always feel like they get everything. Why should they get anything worse? What has happened now is, like, say, with the big sort, the rural areas have become completely Republican. The metro areas have become overwhelmingly Democratic. And so there's even less, the partisan separation, the geographic separation are overlapping. So this just shows the number of states with different preemption laws blocking cities from passing their own minimum wage laws. We had that in where I live. St. Louis passed a $10 minimum wage, and the state said, no, you can't do that. So people got what is the reverse of a raise? A cut to $7.70, paid sick leave, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera. It's become very, very common. And this is probably the most famous. This was a couple years ago in North Carolina, when Charlotte passed an anti-discrimination ordinance to protect LGBT people. And the state legislature said, no, you can't do that. Cities cannot pass their own discrimination or anti-discrimination ordinances. This fellow I was talking to, he's a state senator in Arizona. They passed a law a couple years ago that said if a city has a policy that any legislator can challenge it and ask the Attorney General, is this in accordance with state law? And if the Attorney General says no, the city loses all its funding from the state. And he said, they passed like these bans on gun control and whatnot, and he felt like the cities were not cooperating, so he decided to hit them in their pockets. So there's this obvious hypocrisy. Somebody like Greg Abbott, who we met a while ago, who was always suing Obama, and since becoming governor, where's my friend from Austin? He keeps saying, we can't have these Californication, I think he calls it, they block the cities renewing fracking bans and, et cetera, all these kind of policies. And it's not always these partisan issues. I mean, states really, it varies by state how much power and authority a city has. Some cities, in some states, cities have more autonomy, but in general, the states have there's no question the states can preempt cities. That's within their legal rights. But it's everything. It's not just these, like, say, minimum wage and gun control and these more partisan issues. It's like fire sprinkler regulation, size of parking signs. The states are unapologetic about doing that. And it is partisan, but your state is famous for the Cuomo-De Blasio feud. De Blasio wants congestion pricing or to tax the rich for pre-K, and Cuomo says, no way, Jose. So, and now we have, this is the mayor of Oakland. So earlier this year, the federal government depends on sheriffs or police to carry out a lot of the raids, the ICE raids. They don't have enough marshals and whatnot to do all these raids and certainly not to arrest people for other crimes. And so she tipped off some of the undocumented folks in her town, and then Trump asked Sessions to prosecute her. So again, getting back to our mismatch of the urban density of vote. So Oakland has, I think, 450,000 people. Clinton won Oakland by 140,000 votes, which is double the difference of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania combined. So I'm sorry I'm throwing so much information at you. Do you want to pause for any questions right away? All right, we'll think of some. So in addition to the political splits, we also have this economic split. So this chart just shows job creation in the different quintiles of wealthy to poor zip codes. And you can see the wealthiest zip codes are getting all the jobs. The poor zip codes are actually below where they were. And same idea, this is the number of businesses created since then. This is between 2012 and 2016, so coming out of the recession, all of the businesses and jobs are being created in the major metro areas. So a lot of that is just Austin, Boston, Denver, Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Washington, and then, to a lesser extent, smaller cities like St. Louis have not tremendous economic growth, but certainly more than the rural areas around it. In the last 2 years, there have been something like 52,000 businesses created nationwide. So all of that growth and more is actually just in 4 places: LA, Brooklyn, Queens, and Miami. They together had 56,000 new businesses. So the rich get Amazon and the rest get nothing. Anyway, so this is just a picture I took in Midtown Atlanta. This is an area now called Tech Square. It was 10 years ago, totally derelict area. It's across a highway from Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech put a building on that side, and one thing led to another, and now Google has a presence there, et cetera. They have all this building going on. That green building is the new headquarters of NCR, which is sort of a classic case of what is happening with where the jobs are going. NCR was in Dayton, Ohio, and then it moved to Gwinnett County, which is suburban Atlanta, about 10 years ago, and now it's moved right into downtown. And so many of the big corporations have moved back to downtown. It's not just for millennials and empty nesters, McDonald's, Motorola, you could go on with a whole long list of corporations just in the past couple of years that have moved into the big cities. Again, having that accumulation of wealth and jobs in just a few places. This is a visual representation, again, of the businesses. You can see most of the country is actually losing, whereas just a few places are gaining. And so what happens is this. So I think it's a real problem for our country that we have this concentration of economic wealth in just a few places. People are not where the jobs are, and they can't move there because they can't afford to. So I don't want to downplay race in our politics and racial attitudes. This was a guy at a rally last Saturday that I met. But there are other factors. So this guy, as you can see, lives in a trailer park in Oregon. The timber mills, there's only one timber mill left on the Oregon coast. Almost all the timbering is done. So, half of the jobs now or job growth is in Portland and the 3-county area around Portland. The rest of the state, it's all gone. And you see this story all over the country where, here's my Oregon map, where this was the vote for governor. The Democratic governor won, but with less than 50%, because the rest of the state has turned red, like the rest of rural America. The cities are becoming richer, more diverse, more liberal, and the rest of the places are voting against the cities, basically. And race is an issue, but there's this economic context for it as well. So this is the famous study from a couple years ago from Princeton showing that white deaths were going up due to mainly opioids, deaths of despair, I think they called it, opioids, alcohol abuse, suicide. It's the first time, where white deaths among whites were going up. But like I say, there's this sort of politics of resentment now. Trump's core supporters tend to regard economic policy as a zero-sum game. Many believe that others must lose for them to win. So obviously this was a big part of Trump's appeal. I will bring back the coal jobs. I will bring back the steel jobs. There's so many places where people still talk. When I graduated from high school, I graduated on Friday, and on Monday I went to work at the mill and made more than my teachers. And that doesn't happen now. So you have, all these disparities in education and job opportunity and so on and so forth. That's part of what's driving our politics. And certainly Trump is tapping into that. And he spoke to that. And that was, I think, a huge part of why he won. The places that flipped were mainly in the Midwest, obviously Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but even counties. So I mentioned the Iowa counties on the Mississippi River. Iowa had the most counties that flipped. It was like 31. There were like 206 counties. I voted for Obama and then Trump. And I was like, that made no sense to me. Like, how can you vote for Obama and then Trump? Total opposites in so many ways. And it occurred to me that these were people in kind of the, loser, to use his term, Trump's term, loser parts of the country. Do you remember him saying, I love the poorly educated? I don't mean to be derogatory, but anyway, with Obama, they voted for hope and change. You remember that slogan, of course. And then with Trump, they voted for fear and change. There's a book, since we're at a public policy school here, might as well talk about. This was a good book. It came out in 2016, kind of anticipated what happened with all this, called The Politics of Resentment. It was a book about Wisconsin, I mentioned earlier, Madison, Milwaukee versus the rest. She just went to coffee shops and gas stations and talked to people who all felt that Milwaukee not only didn't share their values, but drained all the resources of the state. Of course, the opposite is true in terms of dollars. LA like I said, there are all these different programs where cities and states send money to Washington and the money comes back, but it doesn't come back evenly. I mean, what would be the point, right? I mean, you skim a little off the top, but otherwise, what would be the point? So LA sends, for every dollar it sends to Washington, gets 71 cents back. And if you look, it's always the poorer, rural, red areas that get more money from Washington, but feel that the big cities get all the breaks because, like say, they have all the economic breaks. It's hard to argue. So I don't know if you've all seen, there's been all this polling from Pew and Gallup just in the last 2 years. Suddenly there's this partisan split over higher ed, which was a total motherhood and apple pie issue. Everyone's for it. Everybody knew it was a ticket to the middle class and it helped the local economy, et cetera, et cetera. But suddenly there's this partisan split. So of course, when they ask these questions, do you approve of higher ed or do you think higher ed is a force for good in the country, whatever, there are Democrats who say no, but usually it's because tuition is too high, costs too much, et cetera. Loans are out of whack, whatever. But Republicans now increasingly say it's they're just training radical liberals for the future, because that's all you hear on conservative media about higher ed is all of these shouting down of Milo and Charles Murray and Ann Coulter, and higher ed is against these people. But of course, there's also, you remember my slides about the voting differences and the economic differences. There's this resentment. So if Trump's tax cut bill, the version that passed the House would have been really bad for higher ed because it was going to not only tax endowments, but it was going to tax graduate student tuition waivers and the like as income. So they managed to get the bill that passed was not as harsh for higher ed, but it did tax the endowments of the bigger, the Yales and the Harvards, the blue state liberal incubator schools. And he's doing this in other ways. Most famously, it's the state and local tax deduction, which of course disproportionately hurts people in the high tax, high cost states, California, New York, New Jersey, et cetera. This is a list of the 23 Republicans in districts that voted for Clinton, House Republicans. So the numbers are still coming in California in particular, but one or two won, including your own Mr. Katko, right? But all the rest lost, or the people succeeding who ran in their place after they retired lost. And in New Jersey, it went from 6-6 in the House delegation to 11-1. So that was the payback for that. And of course, here's just a disparity of the higher education. The education levels has become a key predictor of how people are voting. It's not such a big disparity, but it used to be more favorable to Republicans, becoming more favorable to Democrats. You can see the more education you get, the more you're likely to vote Democratic. People with advanced degrees, 65% Democratic on Tuesday per the exit polls. So, states sue, they represent their people. And here's where we get our multi-state lawsuits. It's unfair to our states for you to tell us, determine our tax policy or the practical effects of our tax policies. If people can't deduct it. I mean, if this was law school, of course, we'd get into the whole enumerated powers and non-commandeering doctrine, but we'll skip all that. But, so there's just this flurry of lawsuits on different questions. Citizenship. This is, this emoluments case. There's an emoluments clause of the Constitution. As president, you're not supposed to take any foreign gifts. And Trump owns the International Hotel in Washington, and all the foreign embassies are having their parties there and so forth. So the lawsuit is actually brought by DC and Maryland. This is from last week, that it's still moving forward. They keep trying to stop it. It's never been tried. We've never had a president with his business is still running in quite the same way. The International Hotel in Washington was the old post office building, and he got contracted and renovated it. And I don't know if you remember, that was actually where he had his press conference where he announced that Obama was actually a citizen, and he had it there, but he did first an hour extolling his own hotel. Anyway, DC and Maryland are saying that their hotels are suffering as a result because foreign corporations and governments are purposely going to the Trump hotel to curry favor, and it's hurting the business of the locally owned hotels. So put up the same meaningless chart about how money flows down, just as a reminder. This is kind of what's at stake. This is what a lot of the battles are about. I mean, to some extent, states can do what they want. They have more autonomy from the federal government than cities do within states, but the federal government sends a lot of money to states. So this is what the war, a lot of the war is about. So like on immigration, of course, the battle is about war, but is about that issue, but it's also about money. So basically, it's always carrots and sticks. Like I said, if you don't take the Medicaid expansion, you don't get the Medicaid money. Now Trump is saying if you don't cooperate with our immigration policies, we're going to take away federal funding. So there does seem to be some room for them to take away money from law enforcement grants, but they're trying to do wider penalties. And of course, the administration is suing back. It's not just states suing the federal government. It's the federal government suing them. Jeff Sessions, before he became the ex-attorney general, on his way out, I don't know if you saw in the news today, he signed a new policy making it harder for the federal government to do consent decrees to get local police and sheriffs to change their policies. I had a professor in college once who he talked about the Volvo syndrome. He said he decided he had little kids that wanted to save car, he was going to buy a Volvo. And he said, I never saw a Volvo. And then I was shopping for a Volvo and I saw them everywhere. It's a Volvo syndrome. So I'm trying to give you the federalism syndrome, I guess. So federalism is still in some ways working the way we think of. There's the famous quote from Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court justice in the New Deal era, who talked about states as laboratories of democracy. It's one of the great cliches in our field. One state tries a law or policy, it works well. Other states try it. If it goes well, it keeps spreading. And eventually Washington does a federal version. And this was right to try, which is the idea that terminally ill patients should be able to try drugs that haven't been approved by the FDA, because why not take a chance? Maybe it could help. So 41 states passed it, and then in May there was a federal law. That's kind of the traditional way we think of it, that actions percolate up from the states to the federal level. And then there's sort of this other aspect where this happens both in states and in Congress, where cities start doing policies and a company says, we can't have a ban on plastic bags because that would be too complicated if we have to do it in one city and not another. So they do a lowest common denominator bill. And that happens at the federal level as well. Companies don't like what states are doing. They ask Congress to come in and intrude and say, we'll agree to some regulation, but let's have something more reasonable. So this map is the trifectas, which is a term for the states that are run both by where the governor and the legislature are held by the same party. So the point of this map is just we still have many red states. We have a few more blue states, and they're going to be doing their separate agendas. There's not going to be any action in Congress except investigations and subpoenas. There's not going to be much policy, but conservatives will look to red states to try their ideas, and Democrats or progressives the other way. So skip. So this is a picture of Manhattan, and then this is a picture of Afton, Missouri. I don't know whether I'd rather go the meat shoot or the mouse races. This is another book I was going to recommend, Uncivil Agreements New, Liliana Mason at Maryland, who talks about politics has become our identity because it weaves in so many other things. We're split by race, we're split by gender, we're split by education, we're split by geography, and we're split by religious attendance, and all these things combine. And that's why our politics are so tribal now, because we find the other side such a terrible threat. So that's all these things, like I tried to say at the beginning, I've thrown a lot at you, I know, but they're kind of converging, that there's this distrust, this polarization, policy, people trying to pursue policies are trying them in different venues, they're fighting the other levels of government. We have all this hostility, and just to leave you an uplifting quote, this was last night. Who would have thought they'd flood Times Square protesting the firing of Jeff Sessions? Anyway, and of course, lawsuits. The other side cannot be trusted. Politics just does not stop on Election Day now. And so, you see these magazine pieces, are we headed for another civil war? I don't think so, but I think this was an interesting thought. We are at a moment, it's very sectarian. We have different policies in different parts of the country that are totally unacceptable to the other parts. It's not slavery now, it's a different mix of issues, but we're having this Cold War between the states. What comes next? How does this all end? Does it get better? Does it keep getting worse? So on the down note, why don't I stop there for questions?
Thank you very much, Alan. Okay, never knew there was a phone there, now I know. Questions, raise your hand. We'll call on folks two at a time. We'll bring microphones to you.
Thank you for not being shy.
There's one here. Who else wants to get the second microphone? There we go, that gentleman in the back. All right, we'll bring a microphone to the two of you. You go ahead, sir.
That was kind of a fire hose.
It was. I'm sorry, I apologize.
They were afraid while I was
I don't think that one turn the microphone on.
That would help, okay. Should be on. Where's the switch?
He turned it on. I think he turned it on. We'll get, yeah, go ahead, Nathan, and we'll just, no, yeah. We'll just go, okay, here, we got you down? There we go, okay, go ahead.
Okay, my question is, on the state level, which is, there are things like, I think corporations are defined on the state level, the regulations that determine what corporations can and can't do. And are there, is that an aspect that can be, is that something that can be used by the states to have an impact on national, on economic policy? And are there other things that states are the arbiters of, that they create the laws that govern this particular aspect, like in perhaps insurance, where they are able to use those as tools of federalism for states' power versus we always are thinking, I mean, we're always thinking the federal government is the one who determines these. What are the things that the states have sort of the levers of power on?
So a lot of corporations are regulated at the federal level, actually. And you mentioned insurance. It's one of the few that are pretty much wholly regulated at the state level for whatever historical reasons. I'm not an expert. But states are always trying to do things to, like I said, the attorneys general were suing to try to, what they wanted was not just money, but they wanted different industries to agree to drop certain practices. And you see things like, California a month or two ago passed a law with a quota for the number of women who have to sit on corporate boards. So, if you're a state as large as California, the idea is you demonstrate that ends up being a positive. Obviously, that's their intention. Who knows what will happen? And like I said, often an idea like that will spread from state to state. Now, typically, ideas spread blue state to blue state to blue state, or red state to red state, red state. And then at some point, maybe the federal government comes in and passes a uniform law that applies evenly across the country. But states are always trying to find ways. Obviously, Democrats tend to favor more regulation, and it's been a big push among Republican governors in recent years, particularly to deregulate. Charlie Baker, I showed his picture, Chris Sununu, who won in New Hampshire. These have been big initiatives. The part of the idea of federalism is that we could have different models and see what works better. So if a state cuts regulation and business improves, then other states are going to compete, right? And in Kansas, they had a big tax cut 4 years ago or 5 years ago. And it was the governor, Sam Brownback, consciously called it an experiment. They were going to cut tax dramatically. It turns out at the state level, you can only cut taxes so much because you have to pay for schools and so forth. So there's more of a limit. They can't print money. They can't run deficits, et cetera. But anyway, that was the idea, and it had some traction. Governors in Oklahoma and Louisiana started looking at maybe we should abolish the state income tax. And there's this constant debate between red and blue states about what works better. Texas is always saying, we have the big job growth because we have low taxes and low regulation. California says, hey, we've got the 5th biggest economy in the world, and it's because we invest in our roads, we invest in our people, we invest in our schools and so forth. So we do have these competing models, but yeah, states are always looking for policy ideas that then get imitated by other states and either squelched or modified by the federal government.
I know a lot of what you've done is just kind of report the data, but in your opinion, is what we're divided on economic in nature, or is it really social, cultural, or kind of a propagandized view of economic issues? And I ask this because I saw that when I last looked in the midterms, we all celebrated how many people got out to vote. It was only 49% of the population. So I'm torn whether civic engagement, if we had a higher voting level, would improve things, or it's really discourse between each other to learn what we're concerned about.
So a couple of questions there, really. So, the midterm, of course, it was not as much as a presidential year was in some places, but, traditionally midterms are much lower than the presidential year. 4 years ago, the turnout was the lowest it had been since World War II. So this year we saw much more engagement, and it was from both sides. Democrats were energized to vote against Trump and the party that he belongs to, but Republicans came out in support. And, it was Democrats made gains, but not huge gains. They obviously took the House, but they didn't take the Senate. In my world, Democrats won 7 governorships, but mainly those what had been Obama states. At the legislative level, Democrats won there were 6,600 seats up for grabs in legislatures, and Democrats made a net gain of 350, which is not huge. The average for the president's party to lose is 425. So they were below the average, not only not a blue wave, but it was below the average. And most of the chambers they took were kind of short putts, like New York Senate, where they only needed 1 seat. They got more than that. Colorado Senate, Maine Senate, these are all ones, Connecticut Senate, they only needed 1 seat to win majorities, and that's where they won. So pretty much the red got redder, the blue got bluer, and some suburbs switched allegiance from Republicans to, and especially highly educated women in the suburbs switched from Republicans to Democrats. But for your question, it's not an either-or question. It's like I said with that book, How Politics Became Our Identity, it's all these things combined, race, gender, education, religion, etc. And it's overlapped with the economic disparities because the red areas are not doing as well economically, and the blue areas are doing great. The blue areas, Denver, San Francisco, Washington, etc., they're tied to the global economy. They're growing. They're doing well. The red areas have been left behind. And so you have this mentality, like I said, when you could graduate from high school and work at the plant, work on a farm, work at the mill, that's pretty much all gone. So you feel not only have your own choices been lowered, but your whole way of life is at stake. And, that's somewhat legitimate. But it becomes, it's always human nature to blame others. The cities are taking all of our tax money. The immigrants are taking our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a ripe environment for racial or even racist appeals. So it's not an either or in my mind. I think it's a complicated situation. But anyway, it's all of the above.
Jeff, go ahead.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the use of ballot measures over time. I'm just thinking about Medicaid expansion and how, we've seen some instances of state legislatures pushing back or governors rejecting Medicaid expansion despite the public actually wanting it and having to resort to the public referenda. And I'm just wondering how that's changed over time.
Well, nothing made Obamacare more popular than the effort to repeal it. The polls always showed more people disapproved of it than approved of it until last year when Republicans in Congress tried to, they called it a repeal, but it was going to repeal parts of it, and it was more of a repeal of Medicaid. But anyway, let's not get too complicated. And of course that failed, and that was one of the big votes that cost Republicans. And it was interesting, I showed Josh Hawley won in the Senate race where I live in Missouri. He is the state attorney general. And he was part of a lawsuit to to try to kill the Affordable Care Act, which is going on now. And on the campaign, he said, I will preserve pre-existing conditions. And the same in Wisconsin. Scott Walker never allowed Medicaid expansion there. He said, I will preserve pre-existing conditions. They saw that this was a popular issue, even though they had opposed the practical implication of the policy that was on the table. Every state is going to take the Medicaid money. Economically, it didn't make sense not to. You could see where there was a policy disagreement about the individual mandate, but really the federal government was sending so much money. A lot of red states have slowly adopted it. And then we had this week, Idaho and Utah and Nebraska, all red states voting for Medicaid expansion. Last year, voters in Maine voted for Medicaid expansion. The Republican governor blocked it. It's never taken effect. He was finally ordered by a court to apply for approval. And he wrote a letter saying, please don't approve our application. So anyway, he was term limited out, and there's now a Democratic governor, Janet Mills, who is obviously going to push this through. And for your larger question, ballot measures used to be, there were a lot of conservative ballot measures, and there still are some, but Proposition 13, which is now 40 years old, was a tax limitation measure in California. It cut property taxes quite a bit. That spread all over, not all over, but in many states, that idea. But it's become a tool of progressives because they're shut out of states. So they cannot get their initiatives through. So the legislature refuses to raise the minimum wage, you put it on the ballot, it passes. And voting itself has become such a partisan issue. Democrats are all for expansive voting rights, the Amendment 4 in Florida, restoring voting rights for former felons just passed this week. Other states did automatic voter registration, same-day registration, et cetera, et cetera. Those were all things they couldn't get through the state legislature. So this is part of the federalist system, is that there's some venue you can try. You get shut out at the congressional level, you try the states, you get shut out states, you can try the ballot measure. So it is a tool for progressives, and conservatives know it, and they've, in the last couple cycles, put more money up against those.
My question is actually about the state attorneys general. You sort of made this distinction between the redder rural counties and the bluer cities. I'm wondering how many of the Republican state attorneys general are actually from bluer cities, and if there are any of these Democratic state attorneys general who are from these rural areas.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. I'm sure there's some both ways. I mean, Josh Hawley, he just became attorney general in Missouri 2 years ago, and he turned right around and ran for Senate, which, it's his prerogative. But anyway, he's a guy who, he went to Stanford, he went to Yale Law School, and he positioned himself as, I'm just a truck driving man and all that kind of stuff. If you're not really from the log cabin, you say you're from the log cabin, right? But that's an interesting question. Maybe I'll look into it. But that's one of the problems Democrats have in statewide offices is their legislators and mayors are all from cities, and so they're typically very liberal, and then that doesn't play well statewide. And there aren't so many members of Congress who are more moderate who can then run statewide. And this is part of the preemption. When they say you can't do minimum wage or paid sick leave, it's partly to kill the policy, but partly also to deny mayors of policy achievements that may help them politically.
Before we get two more questions, Alan, I want to throw one in, which is about what happened at the state and local level with female candidates for office and the proportion of female representation in the state legislatures, because a lot has been made of that in this election cycle at the national level, at the congressional level. What was going on there?
Yeah, I wish I knew the number now. Going into the election in Congress, I know you asked about states, the Republicans in Congress, in the House, are something like 84% white males, and that proportion is going to go up. In Democrats, about 45% white males, and that proportion is going to go down. So we have all these differences, race, gender, blah, blah, blah. And so at the state level, as we saw with record numbers of women running for Congress, we also had record numbers of women running for governor and legislature. So there were 16 women who won major party nominations for governor, which was by far the record. The previous record was 10. And the first black woman ever nominated, Stacey Abrams. first transgender woman, first Native American woman, Michelle Lujan Grisham, who won, a Democrat in New Mexico. She's the first Democratic governor who's a woman of color. New Mexico, by having a Democratic woman succeed a Republican woman governor. It's the first state ever to have a woman governor elected to succeed a woman governor. Kind of amazing. And at the legislative level, it was tremendous growth. So women, it used to be very few women served in state legislatures, back in the Betty Friedan days or whatever. So in like 1970, it was about 7% of the legislators in the country were women. And then over time, with the Year of the Women type increase in women running for office in the early 90s, about 20 years ago, they got to about 24%, or 21, 22, 24%, and it's stayed there ever since, totally flat, just under a quarter. And then there was a huge influx this week, so it's now like 37% of state legislators are women, and almost all that growth is on the Democratic side. So, and of course, there are other firsts for different minority groups as well.
So maybe take two last questions. This woman has her hand up right away, and yes, this
just
person down here at the bottom.
Just finished thought while she's getting the mic.
Oh, yeah, sure.
We had, I forgot, for women in total for governor, we had 9, just a second, Miss, ma'am, if you don't mind.
I know that.
Okay, never mind, go ahead.
I know that liberals tend to be more interested in environmental things, but with all the problems we've had with the wildfires and flooding, is it possible to discern whether these environmental effects, a lot of them caused by climate change, have had effects on the voting?
Well, it's in the mix, right? I mean, climate is the biggest issue we face, right? And yet, it never is a major campaign issue. And you rarely hear anyone talking about climate as an issue. They're talking about schools, talking about taxes, things like that. And, there's no sense that voters are going to adamantly only support climate because, basically the parties are so split on it. If you believe climate is a threat that we have to do something about, you're going to vote Democratic. And if you say, well, climate change is happening, but the climate is always changing, you're going to vote Republican. Al Gore, of course, ended up winning Nobel Prize for advocacy on climate change. And he never talked about it really when he ran for president, all these years ago now. And there was one journalist who asked his consultants, why didn't he ever talk about it? And they said, well, nobody cares about that. It doesn't poll, and it doesn't matter. And they said, yeah, but he could speak about it with passion. That might show he's interested in something. And they said, oh, that never occurred to us. But yeah, climate is still not a voting issue. And, people's memories are short. I did a story last year about Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is an oil town. Some oil companies are headquartered there, and they take climate really seriously in terms of its effects. You never would hear the word climate. You hear extreme weather because they get tornadoes through. But Tulsa in like 30 years ago is the most flooded city in the country, and there's one natural disaster after another. And then finally there was one, and this is interesting. So people were complaining, they called it the Great Drainage Wars there locally, and they wanted something done about it. But the builders didn't. It cost them money to do things to adapt. So they put in money behind a candidate named Jim Inhofe, who became mayor and then later became the most famous climate denier in the Senate. So he, after he left, it was 19 days after he left, they had the worst storm they'd ever had with like 14 people killed and 7,000 homes destroyed. And the new mayor was a weatherman, a TV weatherman, and he took it seriously. And he got, all these people who were agitating, he got them to come up with a plan. And so they have, the city has paid to move people out, buy them new homes. 1,000 homes have been moved. They no longer allow building on the floodplains. If you go to Tulsa, there are all these what look like sunken tennis courts, but they're really drainage ponds, so the water has somewhere to go. And since then, they haven't had any problems. And because now that's 30 years ago, people forget. And so they're saying, why don't we have this nice riverfront? Why don't we build on it? And in Houston, the city council is already giving waivers for building in low-lying areas, so soon after Hurricane Harvey. They're like, yeah, go ahead and build. There's money in it.
The last question here. Go ahead.
So I'm
just kind of generally wondering about like the nature of state like attorneys general suing the federal government. Like, how is that possible, I suppose, and what sort of court does that go before?
Well, I think it goes to a federal court.
Well, I mean, like, sure, but is it like
There's
I'm just sort of like confused as to like how this is happening. Like, is it that the federal government has like violated some sort of like...
Yeah, so, I mean, it depends on the issue, right? But, you know, with the Muslim ban, say, the states basically argue that's patently unconstitutional, violation of church and state, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens is, again, I said, you know, if you have a policy, you go where you think you can get an effect, whether it's ballot measure, state government, federal government, local government. The attorneys general do the same thing. They'll file suits in 4 different courts where they think it's a favorable circuit or whatever, and they go shopping for a judge, and that, you know, Trump complains one judge shouldn't be able to overturn it. And, you know, that's the way our system works, but they consciously are looking for favorable judges. And so, like I said, it depends on the issue. Does it violate the U.S. Constitution? Does it, you know, so the Constitution says there are enumerated powers and unenumerated powers. So enumerated powers means the Constitution says Congress can do X, Y, or Z. Well, the Constitution didn't say you could do T, U, or V. So for a long time, the Supreme Court blocked Congress from doing things, saying you don't have the authority to do it. And through much of the 20th century, it became almost a reverse, where the Supreme Court basically kept finding that if the Constitution doesn't say you can't do it, then it's okay. So, so like with the Affordable Care Act lawsuit, you know, the one a few years ago, they were saying that the federal government violated it was coercive to say, we're taking this money away from you unless you do this. And the Supreme Court agreed. And then for the broader question about whether the whole law was unconstitutional, what Roberts came up with was, you know, the individual mandate was okay because it was a tax. They didn't call it a tax, but it was in fact tax. And clearly Congress has the authority to levy taxes. So like I say, it depends on the issue, but state attorneys general look for some way to find that it violates them. And you know, so you have states now suing over climate change because they say federal climate policies are hurting them because their sea level rising, their coasts are going to be damaged, their waterfronts, et cetera. So they find some avenue where they've been harmed or there's some constitutional principle that's been violated.
So, Alan, I just want to thank you again for giving us a lot to think about, and I want to invite everybody to come to the reception outside where we can continue talking about these issues. So thanks again.